Started. Welcome to a Project Manager's Guide to ITIL. So today we're going to talk about some ITIL basics, but from a project management slant. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and my company, what we do. Then we'll jump right into ITIL, what it is, what the acronym means, why you as a project manager should care. Next, we'll cover at a very high level some of the similarities and differences between PMI's PMBOK guide and the ITIL library. And then once we talk about the frameworks at a high level, we're going to walk through each of the project management process groups and show where ITIL intersects the project. So once I fill your head with all this good information, we'll then talk about what you can do as a project manager to learn more. We will also round out by talking through the ITIL certification path. It's a little bit different than the PMP certification and some of the PMI certifications that are out there. And then we'll finish up and leave plenty of time for question and answers. All right, so my name is Erica Flora. I've actually worked as a project and a program manager for a little over 10 years, primarily in the area of biotech, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, healthcare. I'm a huge proponent of giving back as a volunteer, and that's why we're doing the webinars this week or in celebration of Project Management Week. I've also been a volunteer for PMI, both as a board member in Phoenix, in San Diego, and I've also volunteered with the Washington, D.C. chapter. I've also been involved in a group called ITSMF. It stands for the IT Service Management Forum. They're essentially the equivalent, the PMI equivalent for ITIL. So what else have I done? I've led lots of IT service management projects, anything from putting new ITIL processes in place to revamping processes to leading ITSM platform rollouts and initiatives. I'm a senior instructor and a consultant for Beyond 20. So who Beyond 20 is, essentially, we do IT service management and project management training. We also do assessments, so we come in and help organizations figure out what their roadmap should look like and where you go from here. We've done process consulting. We also specialize in platform implementations, so everything from Microsoft Project Server to IT service management tools and service desk ticketing tools and things like that. Beyond 20 is a global registered educational provider, so everyone attending today's webinar is going to earn one free PDU, and I'll be sending information at the end of this session with all that information. And in fact, PMI Phoenix is going to be submitting everyone or all of their members information after this webinar, so you'll automatically get your PDU as well. So we do these webinars from time to time, probably every month or so. If you go to our website and click the events button, you should be able to see all of our upcoming webinars. So if you're interested in attending more of these, we run them quite often, and we'd love to have you. All right, so let's start by talking about why ITIL. Why should you care about ITIL? Some of you may have heard of this buzzword before. Some of you may not. That's why you're here. So we'll talk about what it is and why it's important for us as IT project managers to have an understanding of ITIL. So let's start with what it stands for. ITIL stands for the Information Technology Infrastructure Library. It's essentially a set of books that were developed in the 1980s out of the UK. And the way that it came to be, and take some of this with a grain of salt because it's kind of urban legend, but basically the way that the story goes is that the CCTA, which stands for the Central Computer and Telecommunications Agency in the UK, they were essentially IT for the British government, would each year, along with all of the other departments and agencies within the government, would give a report on what they had spent their money on and what they needed in terms of budget going forward. And they really struggled with what would seem like some basic questions, but I really think that they're questions that a lot of IT organizations struggle with. Things like, what did we get for the money that we spent? What are the services that that IT provides the British government? What's the cost of those services, and what's the value behind them? They could say things like, well, we know how much we spent on hardware, we know how much we spent on software, we know how much we spent on our people, but they couldn't say, okay, we provide email and here's the value that it brings. our users, and here's the cost to each of our users. So what they did was they said, you know what, let's figure this out. And they commissioned a 7-year study to go out and find what best in class in IT was doing at the time. And in good government fashion, they surveyed 2,500 different organizations, large organizations, small organizations, public, private, across all industries, and came back with 40 giant volumes of information. And that was version 1 of the ITIL library. And what was kind of brilliant about it was that because it was done by the British government, it started to become public knowledge. And the British government started to look at this and say, wow, we actually have some great intellectual property here that we can maybe commoditize. And so what they did is in 2001, they did a refresh of the ITIL books and took the 40 volumes from 40 down to 7. And what they essentially did is version 1, they collected everything. It was very technical in nature. They had everything from what's the best way to manage change in an IT environment versus, what's the best way to cable up a data center. So they took out a lot of the redundancies. They took out the stuff that was technical, that was no longer relevant. And version 2, when it came out in 2001, was very focused on process. What are the good processes that we need to have as an IT organization? And then in 2007, they went back and they refreshed the books again to make it version 3, and that's what we currently have is version 3. It's actually the 2011 edition of the version 3. So a lot of like the PMBOK, the ITIL books have gone through refreshes just like we have on the PMI side. So when you hear the words or when you hear the acronym ITIL, that's all it really means are the books. It's like saying the PMBOK. It's the encyclopedias. And what's really important about the ITIL books is the subject of those books. And the subject of those books is what's called IT service management. IT service management is kind of like saying ITIL is the PMBOK, whereas IT service management is like project management. It's the subject of those books. And what's really interesting to us as project managers was in the version 3 refresh that came out in 2007, it went beyond just focusing on process within IT, and it has a lot more overlap in what we do as project managers, a lot more overlap in projects, and there's quite a number of touch points that are really important for us to know as project managers, especially for those of us working in IT. But let me stop for just 1 second and talk a little bit about IT service management. It's really this concept of an IT organization becoming and putting on the mindset of that of a service provider. It's making sure that as an IT organization, we provide services that are actually valuable to our customers. That we don't just assume we know what our customers want, but we actually go out and ask them and make sure that what we're doing is for the benefit of our customer. So IT service management, what's kind of cool about it is it helps IT organizations change the conversation. So traditionally, we've been providers of technology, and it's about changing that mindset so that we're not just commodity providers of technology, but that we actually really think about how do we differentiate. We have intimate knowledge of our customers, or we should strive to that so that we provide services that are value add. It's also about changing the conversation from just talking about stuff and the cost of stuff to talking about the value that stuff brings, that value add service brings to folks. And what's kind of beautiful about IT service management is it also helps us change the perception that our customers have of us from one traditionally of being a necessary evil to being one of a value add trusted advisor. And what's cool too is there's really nothing else like it. When you think about it, the ITIL library is really just the largest lessons learned collection that we have in IT of really how do we meet the needs of our customers and how do we get ourselves organized internally so that we provide those services that our customers are really going to provide value or find value in. So, IT service management in the marketplace. So, these are some Gartner studies that were done. Actually, they're a few years old, so I know these numbers are a lot higher than what they actually show on the slide. But I believe this was back in about 2009 or so. About half of Fortune 500 companies said that they were doing something with ITIL and IT service management. They may not be calling it ITIL or IT service management. They may be calling it best practice or continual service improvement or something like that. But when you look at especially our large multinational companies, I would say a good portion of them are implementing a lot of these best practices. And when also Gartner went out and talked to CIOs, the majority of CIOs said, you know what, ITIL is something that is on our roadmap. We're going to be heading in that direction in the next 2 years. So if this is the first time that you're hearing the acronym ITIL or you're hearing about IT service management, I can just about guarantee you that you will hear more and more and more these two acronyms in the coming years and months. So why is it becoming so popular? Well, because organizations have found that it helps them. In fact, Gartner did a study where they looked at what caused mission critical systems to go down. And when they investigated root cause, they actually found that only 20% of the time is it due to failure in hardware, software, things like natural disasters. That actually 80% of the time it's due to failure in people and failure in process. And in fact, that's where our company name Beyond 20 came from. What organizations are finding is that you can't spend your way out of issues. You can't spend your way into higher availability, that you really have to look at what your people are doing, what your processes look like. And that's really where ITIL helps. It helps, figure out what folks are doing, ways that you can become more efficient, more effective. And if you look at some of these other bullet points here on the slide, one in particular with AMR research, that when they looked at IT organizations that had started implementing some of these best practices, they were actually able to save about 10% in IT costs without impacting the level of their quality of and customer service. So let's talk about some of the similarities and differences between the PMBOK guide and the ITIL books. There are quite a lot of similarities, so let's dig into some of that now. So if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, we're currently using the PMBOK Guide 5th edition that just came out. It is one book. And within that book, we have 5 process groups. So we've got initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing out. We've also got 10 knowledge areas that those are organized into, and 47 processes in all. So since the 4th edition, we've added about 5 new processes, and we've added a new knowledge area. The same thing is true on the ITIL library. They go through, the books go through numerous iterations every few years or so. So in the ITIL library, there's actually 5 books. They're about the size of a PMBOK, each of them. In fact, some of them are actually bigger than the PMBOK, if you can imagine. And they're called the ITIL library. It's version 3, but the newest edition is called the 2011 edition. So some similarities in the sense that they don't use this term process group, but they've divided their processes into what they call the life cycle phases or stages. And within each of those phases, or within and across those stages, we've got, depending on what you consider to be a process, some of them are minor, some of them are more major processes, but right around about 25 processes. So you can see that they're both very focused on process. And there is some overlap between the project management processes that are in the PMBOK guide and the ITIL library processes. They're also both very cyclical and iterative in nature. What's also interesting about these two is the PMBOK guide really, within the US in particular, really serves as the de facto guide for good practice in project management, whereas the ITIL books really provide information on good practice for IT service management, or I would say for IT in general. All right, so how are they similar? The two frameworks are similar in their mission. They both really try to provide something, or really, in project management versus in IT service management, you're really trying to provide something that your customer wants. In project management as well as in service management, you're trying to solve a problem or you're trying to provide something new. They're both also what's called descriptive frameworks. So they're not what's called prescriptive. Prescriptive says thou shalt do this. You have to do these things in a particular way, like a methodology. They're frameworks that says we're going to describe all the tools that you can use. If you think about the PMBOK as a project manager, you have to figure out what pieces within the PMBOK you're going to use, and you really tailor a lot of the concepts to your organization. You're going to run a very short agile project very differently than you would a multi-year government project. So you're able to tailor it accordingly. Same thing with the ITIL books. It says, here's all the things that other organizations have found to work within IT. Pick and choose what works for your organization. Pick and choose what really is going to help you address a pain within your organization or help you reach a goal. They're also similar in the sense that they each have their own language. And if I know, for example, somebody has their PMP certification, does that tell me that they're a great project manager? Maybe not. But what it does tell me is that they understand the language within the PMBOK. So if I say work breakdown structure or WBS, they know what it is that I'm talking about. Same thing on the ITIL side. If somebody is, let's say, certified at the foundations level, I know that they're going to understand what I'm talking about when I say change management or classification of changes, like a standard change or an emergency change or normal change. They're going to be on the same page as I'm going to be. They both also have grown to be the accepted standard in their area, and they both go through regular review. What else can I tell you? So just like with the PMP, the ITIL library doesn't test you on technology. So for example, if you are going to be sitting for the PMP certification, you don't have to know how to use things like Microsoft Project or Primavera or scheduling or things like that. You have to understand how to create a good schedule, but you don't have to necessarily know how to use the tools. The same is true with the ITIL certification. It's really about process. So in our classes, we don't use computers, actually. People, if you have experience in IT, that's great, but you don't necessarily have to. What's kind of awesome about that is you don't have to be a techie per se to understand IT service management or the concepts in the ITIL books. It makes it really approachable, and it makes it an approachable area of expertise. It also makes it very approachable for the exams. It's a great way for someone who's not necessarily a techie or has a degree in, let's say, MIS or information technology, to get a greater understanding of how IT works, or really rather should work in a perfect world. What else? I think that's about it. Oh, they both have associated certification paths, and they both have professional organizations associated with each of them. So some of this right here on this slide is probably going to be familiar to my project managers here. The PMBOK describes 5 process groups that you move through iteratively as you go through a project from start to finish. So I'm not going to go in too much detail here, but I want to show how ITIL compares, and this is going to be kind of the structure that we use to go through and talk about how those two concepts intersect. So you start out on the left-hand side by initiating the project. So this is where you're defining the new project, determining your stakeholders. You're then planning the project. You're figuring out your scope, your objectives, your plan of attack, your plan of action, and then you're executing it. So you're actually doing the work to meet the specifications of your project. Around the outside of that, you're monitoring and controlling. So you're tracking your project, you're reviewing work, you're putting corrective action in place to make sure that what you planned is actually aligning with and how things are working out or aligning with the original goals that you had set out. And then at the end of each phase or at the end of each project, you're actually doing formal closeout and transfer. So it's very iterative in nature. You're doing a lot of replanning, re-executing, re-monitoring, and controlling. So this is the IT service management life cycle. The life cycle is broken up into 5 phases, and it really shows from cradle to grave how an IT service works essentially. So it starts with, if you look in the middle of the slide, it starts with service strategy. And service strategy is all about, as an IT organization, figuring out, what kind of service provider are we? What services are we going to offer? And who are our customers? And really trying to get a sense of what our customers care about. And then as we get requests for new or different services, we're asking the question, why? Why are we changing this service? Why do we need this new service? What is our customer looking at in terms of their outcome? What's the end result that they expect? And this is really important because I think a lot of times we jump past service strategy and we jump right into service design, because this is a lot of times where we start up with a project by answering the question or asking the question, how does this solution need to look? And I think what we need to really do a better job of is taking a step back and saying, okay, why is it that we're doing this? What are we hoping to get at the end? Let's define that first before we ever move into the how of service design. So once that service gets chartered, if you look towards the bottom left of the diagram, we then move into the phase called service design. Service design is all about designing that blueprint of that new service. So we're going to be looking at what they call the 4 Ps: people, process, products, and our partners that are all going to come together and create that new service. So this is really where the blueprint gets designed. Then once that service is designed, we're going to move, if you look at the top of the diagram, into the phase called service transition. Transition includes all of the processes, all of the activities that are involved with taking that new or that changed service from design, and we're moving it into live operations. The goal here is that we want to protect not only the service that we're introducing, but we want to protect all the other services that we're supporting in service operation. And we want that to be a very smooth transition so that our customers are happy at the end, that IT knows how to support it, that we have a successful go live essentially. So if you look towards the bottom right, once we've moved out of transition, we're now in service operation. And this is all about supporting and managing all of those services day to day. If you look across the outer ring of this diagram is the phase called continual service improvement. This is the last phase in the series, and it's all about continually aligning, and not only aligning, but making sure that we're realigning to our customers, because what happens all the time is we deliver services to our customers and then those customer needs change. So we want to make sure that we have a culture that allows for that, so that 5 years from now we're still providing services that are relevant, that are valuable, that our customers want to come to us for. It's also all about trying to improve all of our services, all of our processes, all of our phases, and having this sense of not just staying with what we have for today, but figuring out how can we do better? How can we get better as an organization? So where we as project managers primarily work and have interfaces with this life cycle is, if you look on the bottom left, service design. This is where we're getting our project charter, and then we're getting our team together. We're designing the service. And then if you look at the top, service transition. And at some point after we transition it to service operation, we close out our project and we're done. So service design, service transition is really where a lot of the overlap is, and that's where we're going to spend quite a bit of the time remaining that we have. So let's talk about where those points of intersection are. Now, I'm going to warn you, this next slide is a little bit busy. But we're going to walk through it, and I think it's really, really helpful. I get a lot of questions from project managers about how these two frameworks relate, and I think this picture does a really good job of showing where that intersection is. All right, so here it is. So if you look with me, let your eyes go up to that first purple arrow at the top. This is where the project management team is involved. That second set of arrows kind of in the middle of the diagram is where the 5 phases of the IT service management life cycle really come into play. So if you kind of match up the arrows, we get involved in some part of strategy potentially, but a lot of design, a lot of transition, and then at some point we transfer that over to operation. We might still do some, let's say, early life support, but at some point the project ends. So if you look at the way top, at the very, very top, we're also collecting business requirements. But at the same time, if you look kind of near the bottom, you'll see these things that say SLR, SLR, and eventually it turns into SLA. We also need to be capturing what that stands for, our service level requirements. So this is important for two reasons. Okay, first of all, is those are going to become SLAs. You may be somewhat familiar with this term, you may not. It stands for service level agreement. But what a service level agreement is when that service goes into operation, it defines what our customers can expect from that IT service once that service is live. So things like if there's an incident, or let's say there's a failure in that service, we can commit to a certain response time or a certain resolution time. We also can commit to availability. We can commit that this service will be available during these particular times. The second reason that this is important is because this information forms the basis of what's called service acceptance criteria. So if you look just below that first purple arrow that says project team, you'll see SAC kind of across the screen. That stands for our service acceptance criteria. And essentially what this is what that passing score looks like to make sure that that service is ready for go live. So we're going to be defining what our service acceptance criteria looks like. We're going to be defining what our commitments to our customers need to look like. There's also another key piece of this diagram. If you look right in the middle, there's this white document, this deliverable with the acronym SDP, Service Design Package. This is something that gets delivered at the end of design, and what it really does, it's helpful in so many ways. What it does is it defines how we designed this solution, who designed it, what were the constraints we were working under. It also tells you going forward, it tells the transition team how they need to test it, how they need to validate it, how they need to release it. It tells the service operation team how they need to support it. It gives them context around this is how this service underpins or supports what our customers are trying to do. So it really gives context. It gives a lot of information about that service. And this is a key document that that's going to be really helpful beyond just the project team, and it's something that needs to be created as part of what we're doing. The very, very bottom of this diagram shows how the project management team needs to interact with overall IT change management. This is to make sure that the right information is communicated out to the greater environment, make sure that changes to a service are going to be captured, and that we protect the live environment. So we'll talk about some differences between how we as project managers look at change management and how IT overall looks at change management and where those intersection points are going to be. Okay, so the first intersection point between project management and IT service management is in our initiating process group within, if you think about the process groups that are mentioned within the PMBOK. So when a service is chartered by IT, this is going to become our project charter, and it's going to become part of our project portfolio. IT in general, however, may have or may be maintaining what's called a service portfolio. And some projects may be a service. They may align one-to-one relationship, but there may be one particular service that could be numerous projects. You could have one project that's numerous services. So these could be a little bit different. Some of the things you need to think about or make sure that you include in the charter are going to be things like, and things that need to go into planning are going to be things like understanding that total cost of ownership for that service. So even though we may not be involved later on when this goes into operation, the greater IT organization is going to care about, okay, from cradle to grave, what's the cost of this service going to look like? So we need to involve operation at this point. We need to think about the longer term picture because we may decide as project managers, we're judged on things like being under budget and within time and within the right scope and things like that. But We may make decisions that are better in the short run and not so great in the long run. So we want to make sure that we've thought past or beyond the end of our project when we think about cost. Also, in that project management process called identify stakeholders, this is something we need to consider, especially if we're working in IT and our organization is thinking about IT services and practicing IT service management, that our stakeholders go beyond just the business and our team members, that in a service management environment, we have to think about our end users, we have to think about our ITSM process owners. Remember I said there's about 25 different process owners in ITIL. We have to think about who's going to own this service over the long term. So once we transition it over to operation, who's the person that's going to actually own this service? And we need to make sure that we involve them. We need to get service operations involved. So things like our service desk, the folks that have to support it, tier 2, tier 3. So as we move into planning and capturing requirements from each of these stakeholders and each of these stakeholder groups, this is going to become really important. So as we move into planning and the process called collect requirements, once we've identified and determined those stakeholders, we then need to collect their requirements. And what I find is that a lot of times project management groups are really good at capturing utility requirements, what the ITIL book's called utility or fit for purpose. What that means is this service going to do what we need it to do? So the teams tend to be really good at capturing that. But what I don't see teams consistently capturing are what's called warranty requirements. The ITIL books define that as being fit for use. And what that means is that service going to be there when I need it? So what I think sometimes we have to get better at is defining things like availability. How available does this service need to be compared with all of the other services that IT is supporting? How much capacity do we need over the long term? How much security do we need? What does continuity need to look like? And disaster recovery, and have we thought about that? And all those kinds of things need to come into play as we're collecting requirements, and they're going to need to go into that document I talked about in that diagram that we looked at last called our service design package. What else? So some other project management processes that have some touch points with ITIL, the process called develop our project management plan and define or sequence our activities. So some specific things that we need to think about as we're rolling out a new or changed service are going to be things like, how are we going to measure this thing once it goes live? How are we going to know when it's up, when it's not, when it's degraded, when we need to alert people that we may have a failure? How are we going to make sure that knowledge is transferred to each of the stakeholder groups? How's the release going to be done? How are we going to integrate with things like configuration management and change management? Because those terms mean different things to us within projects versus us within the greater good of IT. So as we move into executing, this process group most closely aligns with the ITIL processes in the phase called ITIL service transition. So namely things like there's a ITIL process called transition planning and support. This is where we're coordinating all of our project activities across projects, across suppliers, across services and service teams. There's also an ITIL process called release and deployment. So this is all around figuring out how we're going to package, build, release, test, deploy, and establish that new or that changed service. So if release and deployment, if this service management process is in place, IT is going to have a very specific release policy that's going to describe how and when releases need to happen. So we want to make sure that we understand what's in that release policy if we do have one, release and deployment policy. And then the ITIL books mention some other things that are kind of interesting. There's this tool called a release assessment. So understanding if we're ready for, a readiness assessment to make sure that we're ready for go live. They also talk about doing almost essentially a dress rehearsal or what they call a service rehearsal. Pretending like Okay, the service is now live. Does the service desk understand if a call comes in what this service is, who to report it to, how to route the tickets? Do we understand what our service level agreements are? Are we making sure that we're meeting those? Do we understand how it fits in the priority, level of priority compared to other services? They also talk about piloting and how that should be done. So it gives us lots of ideas around how we transition, how we execute, how we transition to operation. So transition also has a lot of overlap with our process group called monitoring and controlling. So there's an ITIL process called validation and testing, and there's this concept within validation and testing called a service V model that makes sure that we're doing the right amount of testing so that we confirm that we're meeting our requirements, not only at the highest level, at the business level, but at our service level, at all the component level, so that we validate we're going to release a service that is going to meet up with what our customers truly want and expect from this new service or this change service. There's also a process called within the PMBOK called Perform Integrated Change Control. Has a lot of touch points with ITIL service transition, specifically a process called change management and another process called service asset and configuration management. So it's worth noting that at this point, there is a difference between how we as project managers look at change management and how IT looks at change management. So we have this group called a change control board. And when we have changes, we're going to look at them as a project manager and assess the impact to our project. We'll bring these changes before our change control board. And what they're going to be looking at is how these changes affect our scope, our schedule, our cost, all things within the project, because their goal and our goal as the project manager is to make sure that we ensure or protect, make sure that our project is going to meet its objectives. Now, what a CAB or change advisory board within IT change management is going to be looking at is they're going to be looking at anytime we make a change to a service that could potentially affect the live environment, their whole goal is to look at it and say, is this going to affect the live environment? So at some point, certain changes that happen within our project, we're going to need to bring those to the change advisory board because they affect not only our project, but they have the potential to affect other projects. They have the potential to affect the availability, let's say, of other IT services. So we need to understand where that line is and when we need to bring things to our CAB versus when things need to go to the change control board. So there's definitely quite a bit of interface there too. And then as far as configuration management goes, we care about the configuration within our project. Configuration management cares about all the components within and across IT services. And so if we're making changes that affect overall configuration, we need to make sure that that aligns with the greater community. Okay, and then our last process group, the closing process group, has a lot of overlap not only with service transition, but with that ITIL phase called continual service improvement. So when we close out our project or we close out our phase, we're transferring knowledge. And in fact, there's a whole ITIL process around what's called knowledge management. Knowledge management is all about ensuring that the right people get the right information at the right time so that they can make good decisions and that they're empowered to do their job well. So some things to be thinking about as we close out our project or our phase is we want to make sure that we actually transfer that knowledge. We don't just throw something over the wall and we're like, have fun supporting that we actually figure out, okay, how can, if my design team is different than my support team, how do I make sure that my support team, essentially has the brain that came up, that, really is in the folks that did the design, that they understand what the known errors are, that they have knowledge that gives them context, that really helps them understand that new or that change service. So the service desk, for example, knows how to support it so that tier 2, tier 3 understands how to troubleshoot, that they really understand what the configuration is within that service. They know why it was designed this way, what the purpose of the service is, all that kind of stuff. So there's this whole process about how do we as an organization try to get the information into folks' hands that really need it and that it makes sense to them and allows them to do their job well. Some other things too, we want to make sure that we capture user feedback, that at the end we're doing a lessons learned, and that gets communicated out beyond just our project team, that actually gets used. They also talk about something called providing early life support, which probably a lot of you do, in the handover, making sure, this also is about making sure that, let's say, the service desk, that we sit with folks at the service desk, that they understand this new service, that we help them field calls, that we help make sure that that is smooth for folks. All right, so some next steps. So this is probably going to sound like heresy to some of you, but as a project manager, it's really more than about being on time and under budget and within scope. No one is going to remember if your project was on time and on budget if the service that we deliver doesn't meet our customer needs over the long term. They won't remember it. What we have to do is educate ourselves as well, that within IT, it's bigger than just that. We want to make sure that we have overall service success, not just project success. And we need to make sure that we set up our organization for that greater success, and take on more of a long-term holistic view. We as project managers also need to incorporate operations early and often, not at the end when we say, here's our completed project, have fun supporting that, but that we need to really look at them as partners, because we really are partners, and we're really all working together. We should all be working together to provide services that are really going to be valuable to our customers. I mean, it ultimately is for our customers. The other thing I would say is that we need to understand the language of ITIL. If you're working within an IT environment, you're going to be hearing a lot of these terms, and you need to know what they mean. So, for example, you need to know what a service is, an IT service, and understand how that's different than technology and projects. You need to understand how IT uses the terms like change management, configuration management, how they're different. And I would say we need to learn how and when and where to integrate with IT service management concepts. So throughout our project, where are some things that we need to be incorporating, maybe new or different information into our project plans or our schedules or things like that, so that we set our teams up for long-term success. So let's talk about the certification path. So it works on credits, and this slide is also going to be a little kind of confusing and busy when I first show it to you. It's essentially like getting a degree in service management. So there's a number of different classes you can take along the certification path, and I'm going to walk us through what all of those look like. All right, so if you look at the very bottom, the gray box that says foundations, this is where everyone starts. So essentially you have to get foundations certified to take any of the other classes within the ITIL path. So foundations, we teach this as a 3-day class. It is 2 credits. So essentially what that means is once you pass the exam, you get 2 credits. And then those credits, think of them like college credits, you can apply them to get all the way up to the top, which is ITIL Expert. Now, to become an ITIL Expert, you need 22 credits. So once you pass foundations, then you can get additional credits. But everyone starts at foundation. Foundation is really about teaching you the language of ITIL. It's similar, I would say, to like the CAPM. It teaches you what all the terms are, it teaches you how everything kind of fits together. It isn't until you get to the intermediate classes. I think the intermediate classes are a bit more like the PMP, where they're more subjective and you have to actually apply these concepts to real life situations. Foundations is really just understanding the what of ITIL. What do all the terms mean? How do all the processes fit together, and that kind of stuff. Once you pass foundations, then you can take a variety of the intermediate classes, and there's 9 of them listed here. If you look towards the left in the orange boxes, there's 5 what's called life cycle classes. There's one essentially for each of the 5 books. So you can take a 3-day class just on strategy or just on design or just on transition. Each of these classes are 3 days in length, and once you pass that exam, you get 3 credits. If you look towards the right, those purple boxes, those are what's called our capability classes. And essentially, they're the same processes, they're just broken up differently. SOA is a really great class for, I get a lot of interest from project managers on this. It's called Service Offerings and Agreements. One of the processes there is portfolio management. How do you manage your overall portfolio? How do you make strategic decisions? There's a lot of strategy processes there. PPO stands for Planning, Protection, and Optimization. So as we move into design, these are the processes that you talk about. RCV stands for Release, Control, and Validation. So how do we release this or transition it? So you've got things like change management, configuration management, knowledge management. That's also a really good course. And then OSA stands for Operational Support and Analysis. And these are basically your service operation types of processes, things like incident management, problem management, once that service is transitioned to operation. So capability are really more for the day-to-day practitioner. They teach you more in-depth information about the processes, whereas life cycle is more of a higher view of those processes. I would say the focus is more for managers and consultants. You can take one, you can take many of the intermediate classes. The key thing here is that what the intermediate classes do that's different from the foundations is they teach you the how of ITIL. How do you put in a new process? How do you revamp an existing process? What are the metrics that you should use to capture or improve that process? So that's kind of how the classes are. So if you guys have other questions about the intermediate classes, I'm happy to talk with you at length. But basically, the life cycle classes are each 3 days a piece. The capability classes on the right, those are each 4 days. And once you pass that exam, you get 4 credits. So essentially, you need 15 credits at that intermediate layer to qualify to take the capstone called MALC, or Managing Across the Life Cycle. That is a 4-day class. Once you pass that exam, you get 5 credits, and you have, at that point, all the 22 credits that you need in order to become ITIL Expert certified. Now, does everyone need to go to ITIL Expert? Certainly not. If you have an interest in becoming, let's say, an IT service management consultant, or leading a big IT service management initiative, or teaching ITIL, ITIL Expert is really a good way to go because it teaches you and it gives you deep subject matter expertise across everything. But if you're just working in, let's say, an IT environment and you want to understand the terms that people are using and what all that means, then foundations might be good for you as well. If you're somewhere in the middle and let's say you're charged with improving processes as let's say a project manager, or you own one of the processes, it might be really good for you to take maybe one or a couple of the intermediate classes. Okay, so I've got a couple questions here on this slide in particular. So, okay, the question is, how many credits do you get per book? So for each of the classes, they're different credits. So for service strategy, once you take that 3-day class and you get the 3 credits, that's essentially how that works. You can take all 5 of the life cycle, you can take all 4 of the capability if you want, or you can also pick and choose. So I see people take like continual service improvement on the left-hand side in life cycle, and then they'll pick like 3 capability classes that they like. So you can do it however you want. You can even take duplicate classes. So service transition on the left-hand side is very similar to release, control, and validation on the right-hand side. You can totally take both of those if you want. So however you want to get to 15 credits, if your goal is to get up to ITIL Expert, you can certainly do that. If you have more questions, please do send me an email or send me an email. That would be great, and I'm happy to answer questions. Okay, so a couple of upcoming classes that we have. We actually have one coming up in Phoenix. I'm actually going to be teaching that next week. It is a fabulous class, if I do say so myself. It's a 3-day class. It does include the exam, and for all my project managers that are PMP certified and need PDUs, it does give you 24 PDUs, so a little more than a year's worth of PDUs. It is a great certification to have under your belt. I will tell you that when I first became PMP certified, it was really a differentiating factor. You know, in my industry, there weren't a lot of project managers that were PMP certified, and so it certainly helped me stand out. Now I would say PMP doesn't quite have that differentiating factor that it did before. I mean, it's becoming, I would say, more of a must-have than a nice-to-have. Back when I got it, it was more of a nice-to-have. But getting ITIL foundations is a great complement to a PMP certification. I will tell you that those two frameworks really work well together, because if you're going to make improvements within IT and put ITIL processes in place, or put an IT service management tool in place, it really helps to have those project management skills, because you still need to manage these projects to scope and cost and schedule, and make sure you've got good project management methodology behind it. And having ITIL certification along with PMP really teaches you a language and gives you new tools that you didn't necessarily have in your tool belt. Got a couple more questions here. Okay. Is the class time a requirement, or can you just test out? So at the foundations level, you can self-study and take the exam. What I will tell you, though, is it's kind of like the PMP. You can self-study for the PMP, but you will invest a lot more time on your own than you will if you take a boot camp. So we actually guarantee that if you take a class with us on the afternoon of the third day, you actually take the exam with the class, and you get the certification all in one. I've known people that have studied on their own. It's a lot of information. So think of it as it's bigger than 5 PMBOK, and trying to memorize all that stuff and get ready for an exam, it's a bit of an undertaking. So you do yourself a huge favor by taking a compressed class. When you get to the intermediate classes, you are required to take a class from an accredited training provider. So even if you self-study for foundations, if you want to go beyond that, you have to go with a class, because the tests get a lot harder and you need a lot more context around how you apply these concepts to the real world. Okay. So how many years of IT experience do you need for each segment? Are there education requirements? So what's cool about this, and let me go back just one step. In order to take foundations, you don't need anything. You don't need to apply like you do for the PMP. You don't have to show that you have educational, that you have a degree or anything like that. To take foundations, you just need to show up, essentially. And once you take foundations, once you pass the exam, what's also really cool about it is you don't have to take any continuing credits. You don't have to collect any PDUs or anything like that. Once you're certified, you're certified. Now, if you want to go beyond foundations, you can't just jump right in and take some of the intermediate or advanced classes. You have to have taken a foundations class and pass the foundations exam. But once you pass the foundations exam, you can take any of those intermediates. Once you get 15 credits at that intermediate level, then you can take the capstone class. But with all of these, you don't have to have any continuing education or any sort of requirements or fill out an application like you do with the PMP at all. Okay, another question. Where do you see ITIL versus Six Sigma intersect? Oh, this is such a great question. This is actually how I came to learn about ITIL. I was actually a consultant at Pfizer in La Jolla years ago, and they were a big Six Sigma shop. They were wanting to do to figure out some metrics that would help them understand the health of IT and give them transparency and visibility into what IT was doing, because they were a big, international organization and didn't always have visibility across IT. And so my first kind of foray into ITIL is I led this project, and they said, when we collect metrics, we want to use best practice in IT. And so we want to use Six Sigma, and we want to use this thing called ITIL. And I was like, great, what is ITIL? I need to go learn what ITIL is. And that's essentially how I became certified. I went and took a foundations class. And what was really cool about it is, as a project manager, I love me some process. You want to have a good process for how you plan projects, how you execute projects, how you monitor them, control them, close them out, all that kind of stuff. And when I took ITIL, I was like, wow, this is all process too. It's just from a different perspective. And, they complement each other beautifully. I would also say ITIL and Six Sigma complement one another beautifully. There's a lot of stuff, especially from the continual service improvement phase, that talks about what you should measure, how you should improve, that really pulls a lot of Six Sigma concepts into it. And the reason why I say ITIL complements project management, Six Sigma, all these other frameworks, methodologies, standards that are out there is it's very specific in what it's trying to do. It's really about how do you provide better service to your customers versus, Six Sigma, how do you have less defects in a repeatable process and things like that. But there's a perfect complement to one another. Question here. Okay, let me go ahead to this last slide here that I have for questions. If I don't get to your question today, I know we're running a little bit short on time here. If I don't get to your question, I will let you know over email. Also, feel free to email me. Here's all my contact information. I also wrote just a quick little article. It's probably only about a page or two on ITIL from a project manager's perspective and kind of my takeaway and what I find cool about ITIL. You're welcome to go there, and you're welcome to follow us on Twitter, connect with me on LinkedIn, and follow us on YouTube. We also have lots of videos. This one is being recorded, and I'm going to try to get this up here on YouTube in the next couple of days. A couple other questions real quick before we leave. I know I've got a couple more here. How long does the foundation certification last? Does it last a year, 2 years, 10 years? It lasts for a very long time, many years. So if you think about from version 2 to version 3, version 3 came out in 2007, and version 3 was a big shift from version 2. Version 2 only had 11 processes in it, and they described the service desk, the team of people that really serve as the front line within IT. When they went to version 3, they more than doubled the processes. They added additional teams. So there really was a lot more information they added in version 3. So when that came out in 2007, you had to take a bridge class that basically I think was only like 1 or 2 days that bridged and taught you the new information. So if there ever is a big shift within the ITIL library, which I don't foresee that happening, at least in the next few years, you will probably need to take a bridge class to bridge whatever that new information is. But, that was 2007 was the last big one. So what is that, 5 years? It'll last you at least that long. Is it too late to register for the foundations class in Phoenix next week? No, absolutely not. We still have space. So if you go to just beyond20.com, you're more than welcome to register. You can also give us a call at that 866 number that is on the screen right now, and we would love to have you in class. Oh, cool. Okay, another question. How successful is ITIL in a fast-paced, agile environment where iteration is a daily concept or a daily constant? ITIL works really well with agile concepts. And in fact, whenever we do an IT service management project with customers, we always integrate it with agile concepts. So we do 2-week sprints. We do a lot of the stuff that's in agile. So the daily scrum and all this kind of stuff, it works really beautifully. And in fact, I think that's the best way to implement some of these concepts, because what happens is, ITIL is a journey. It's something that really transforms the IT organization, and that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. But if you apply agile concepts to it, you maintain stakeholder excitement. There's actually, in fact, the folks that put out the 5 ITIL books in the UK, There's another book called Agile Development and Service Management, and how those two things work together and how one really complements the other. But yeah, it works really, really well. Yeah, it doesn't impede, one does not impede the other. It certainly can be done. Cool. So I think that's all the questions, or that's really all the time we have today. But please do reach out to me. Please connect on social media. And thank you guys so much for your time. Have a great rest of the Friday and a great weekend.